The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Chen adjusted her stethoscope around her neck, the weight of it as comforting as a prayer. At 26, she had already spent 4 years navigating these sterile corridors, her white sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum with a rhythm that had become the metronome of her existence. The early morning shift always began the same way: coffee from the machine that tasted like burnt dreams, a quick check of her patient roster, and the quiet moment of preparation that separated her civilian self from the healer she became when she crossed the threshold of the cardiac wing. The hospital's East Wing specialized in elderly care, particularly veterans from conflicts spanning decades. Sarah had specifically requested this assignment after nursing school, drawn by something indefinable about the old warriors who filled these beds. Perhaps it was the way their eyes held stories that textbooks could never capture, or how their weathered hands would tremble not from age, but from memories that refused to stay buried. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had initially been skeptical. "It's demanding work," she'd warned. "These men have seen things. They don't trust easily." But Sarah had persisted, and now, 4 years later, she moved through the cardiac wing with the fluid grace of someone who understood that healing was as much about listening as it was about medicine. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the tiled floors, and Sarah felt that familiar surge of purpose that made the modest paycheck and the exhaustion worthwhile. Room 314 housed Harold Hank Morrison, an 83-year-old Marine veteran of both Korea and Vietnam. His medical chart read like a catalog of sacrifice: shrapnel wounds, a replaced hip, diabetes, and a heart condition that had brought him to St. Catherine's 3 weeks ago. But Sarah knew him as something more than his ailments. Hank was the man who remembered every nurse's birthday, who kept a small American flag on his bedside table, and who still tried to stand whenever she entered his room, despite her gentle protests. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, pushing through the door with her medication cart, the wheels protesting with their familiar squeak. The elderly Marine was already awake, sitting up in bed with military precision, his gray hair combed neatly despite the early hour. His pale blue eyes, still sharp beneath bushy eyebrows, tracked her movement with the alertness of a man who'd spent decades watching for threats. "Sarah, my dear," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of age and too many cigarettes. "You're like clockwork. 0700 hours, right on the dot." She smiled, checking his vitals monitor before beginning her morning routine. His heart rate was steady, blood pressure within acceptable ranges, though slightly elevated. "How did you sleep, sir?" "Like a Marine on watch," he replied, which was his way of saying poorly. Sarah had learned to decode his military metaphors over the weeks. She made a note to speak with Dr. Rodriguez about adjusting his sleep medication. The morning routine was a careful dance they'd perfected together. Sarah would check his medications, take his vitals, and help him with the physical therapy exercises that kept his joints mobile. But more than that, she would listen. Hank Morrison was a storyteller, and Sarah had become the repository for tales of brotherhood forged in jungle foxholes and desert outposts. She learned about his late wife, Margaret, who'd waded through 2 tours and raised their 3 children largely alone. She heard about his best friend Tommy Kowalski, who'd saved his life in Khe Sanh and been killed 2 days later. Each story was a trust, a piece of a life that the elderly Marine was carefully cataloging before time ran out. "My youngest grandson, Michael, he's shipping out to Quantico next week," Hank said as Sarah adjusted his IV line. His voice carried pride and worry in equal measure. "Kid's got more courage than sense, just like his old grandfather." "He comes from good stock," Sarah replied, checking the flow rate of his medications. "Though I suspect you taught him that courage comes with wisdom, not recklessness." Hank's weathered face creased into a smile. "You know, Sarah, you remind me of Margaret sometimes. She had that way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The comparison touched Sarah more deeply than she let on. She'd grown up in a household where achievement was measured in practical terms: grades, salary, social status. Her parents, both immigrants who'd built successful careers in engineering, had supported her decision to become a nurse, with the kind of polite encouragement that masked their hope that she'd eventually pursue something more substantial. But here, in these quiet moments with patients like Hank Morrison, Sarah felt the weight of real purpose. She wasn't just administering medications. She was bearing witness to lives lived fully, completely, courageously. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm. Sarah made her rounds through the cardiac wing, checking on Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a retired teacher whose room overflowed with cards from former students. Visiting Robert Bobby Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname. A Vietnam veteran who spent his days sketching birds he could see from his window, and stopping by to chat with James Jimbo Washington, a Gulf War veteran whose booming laugh could be heard 3 rooms away despite his recent surgery. Each patient represented a thread in the complex tapestry of St. Catherine's cardiac wing. Sarah had learned their quirks, their fears, their sources of joy. Mr. Patterson saved the good chocolate from his meals to share with the nursing staff. Bobby Chen had taught her to identify different species of sparrows and finches. Jimbo Washington could recite entire passages from movies he'd watched dozens of times, turning his medical consultations into impromptu entertainment sessions. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Sarah. The way Mrs. Patterson's eyes would light up when Sarah asked about her grandchildren. The gentle smile that crossed Bobby Chen's face when a particularly beautiful bird landed on his windowsill. The peaceful expression that settled over Hank Morrison's features when he talked about Margaret, as if the simple act of remembering her brought her back to life. Dr. Elena Rodriguez found Sarah around 9:30 a.m., reviewing charts at the nursing station. At 45, Dr. Rodriguez was everything Sarah aspired to be: professionally brilliant, compassionate, and uncompromising in her dedication to patient care. She'd been the attending physician on the cardiac wing for 8 years, and she'd become something of a mentor to Sarah. "How's our Marine this morning?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, settling into the chair beside Sarah's workstation. The question referred to Hank Morrison, though they both knew she cared deeply about all their veteran patients. "Vitals are stable, but I'm concerned about his sleep patterns," Sarah replied, pulling up Hank's chart on the computer screen. "He's been having more frequent nightmares. Last night, the overnight nurse reported he was calling out for someone named Tommy." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Tommy Kowalski. He mentions him often during our consultations. Best friend who was killed in Vietnam. PTSD doesn't always diminish with age, unfortunately. Sometimes it intensifies." She made a note in Hank's electronic file. "Let's try adjusting his prazosin dosage. It might help with the nightmares." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the elevator bank. Sarah looked up to see 2 men in expensive suits talking animatedly with Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the hospital's chief administrator. Even from a distance, Sarah could sense tension in their body language. Dr. Thornfield's usually perfect posture was rigid, and she was gesturing more emphatically than usual. "Hospital inspection?" Sarah asked Dr. Rodriguez, who was also watching the interaction with interest. "Unlikely. Those aren't state inspectors." Dr. Rodriguez's expression was troubled. "Those are lawyers, corporate lawyers, if I had to guess." The observation sent an unexpected chill through Sarah. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital had been family-owned for decades, run by the Thornfield family with a commitment to community service that sometimes put compassion ahead of profit margins. But recently, there had been rumors. Whispered conversations about financial pressures, corporate buyout offers, and the need to modernize operations. Sarah had dismissed most of it as hospital gossip, but seeing Dr. Thornfield in what appeared to be a tense negotiation made the rumors feel suddenly concrete. "I hope it's nothing serious," Sarah murmured, returning her attention to patient charts, though her mind kept drifting back to the scene by the elevators. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Sarah administered medications, helped patients with their meals, and assisted with the various therapeutic activities that filled the days in the cardiac wing. Around 11:30 a.m., she found herself back in Hank Morrison's room, helping him with his physical therapy exercises. The elderly Marine was working through a series of arm raises designed to maintain his upper body strength, though Sarah could see the effort was taxing him. "That's enough for now, Mr. Morrison," she said gently, helping him settle back against his pillows. "You don't want to overdo it." "Nonsense," Hank replied, though he was breathing more heavily than usual. A Marine doesn't surrender to a few sore muscles. But even as he spoke, he allowed Sarah to adjust his position and check his pulse. It was then that Sarah noticed something that would, in retrospect, seem like foreshadowing. Hank's eyes weren't focused on her or on the physical therapy equipment. Instead, he was staring at the window that looked out over the hospital's main parking area. His expression was alert, almost wary. "Everything all right, sir?" Sarah asked, following his gaze. "Probably nothing," Hank said slowly. "Just unusual activity in the parking lot. More cars than usual, and that van's been sitting there for about 20 minutes without anyone getting out." Sarah looked out the window. The parking lot appeared normal to her, cars coming and going, visitors walking toward the main entrance, the usual midday activity of a busy hospital. But she'd learned to trust Hank Morrison's instincts. a man who'd survived 2 wars and 40 years of civilian life afterward, had developed senses that went beyond normal awareness. "Should we call security?" she asked. Hank considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, probably just my old paranoia kicking in. You know how it is once a Marine, always watching for trouble?" But as Sarah prepared to leave his room, Hank caught her wrist with surprising strength. His pale blue eyes were suddenly intense, focused on her with an urgency she'd never seen before. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if something ever happened, if there was ever trouble, you get yourself to safety first. Don't worry about an old Marine. I've had my time." The comment was so unexpected, so uncharacteristic of their usual conversations, that Sarah felt a flutter of unease. "Mr. Morrison, you're going to be fine. Your heart is responding well to treatment, and Dr. Rodriguez says you might even be able to go home next week." "That's not what I meant," Hank said, still holding her wrist. I want you to know that if something happens, you matter more than an old soldier. Promise me you'll remember that." Sarah studied his face, seeing something she couldn't quite identify. Fear? Premonition? Or just the anxiety of an elderly man confronting his own mortality? "I promise," she said finally, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was promising. Hank released her wrist and settled back against his pillows, but Sarah noticed that his eyes returned immediately to the window. The lunch hour brought its own rhythm to the cardiac wing. Sarah helped patients with their meals, administered noon medications, and coordinated with the various specialists who made their rounds during the day. Dr. Patricia Collins, the hospital's social worker, stopped by to discuss discharge planning for several patients. Nurse Mary Catherine O'Brien, who'd worked at St. Catherine's for 22 years, shared gossip about the morning's legal consultation. "Corporate vultures," Mary Catherine called them, "looking to strip the soul out of this place." But throughout the afternoon, Sarah found herself thinking about Hank Morrison's unusual behavior. The elderly Marine was typically jovial, optimistic despite his health challenges, always ready with a story or a joke. The man she'd encountered that morning, alert, wary, almost protective, was someone different. Someone who'd been activated by instincts that civilian life hadn't entirely buried. Around 2 p.m., Sarah was updating patient charts when she heard raised voices from the direction of the administrative offices. The cardiac wing was separated from the hospital's business center by 2 corridors and a set of double doors, but sound carried strangely through St. Catherine's older architecture. She couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably argumentative. "Sounds like someone's having a bad day," said Nurse Jennifer Martinez, who was restocking medication supplies at the adjacent workstation. "More corporate meetings," Sarah replied, though she felt increasingly uneasy about the hospital's sudden focus on business consultations. The afternoon proceeded normally until approximately 3:15 p.m., when Sarah noticed increased activity in the hospital's main lobby. Security guards were positioning themselves at key locations, and she could see additional personnel arriving through the main entrance. The activity wasn't alarming. St. Catherine's occasionally hosted special events or received VIP visits, but combined with Hank Morrison's earlier unease, it contributed to Sarah's growing sense that something was different about this day. She was returning from the pharmacy with medications for the evening shift when she encountered Dr. Thornfield in the corridor outside the cardiac wing. The chief administrator looked tired, stressed in a way that Sarah had never seen before. Her usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, and her eyes held the kind of focused intensity that came from dealing with significant problems. "Dr. Thornfield," Sarah said politely, "is everything all right?" The chief administrator paused, studying Sarah's face as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "Just some administrative challenges, Nurse Chen. Nothing that affects patient care." But her tone suggested otherwise. "If there's anything the nursing staff can do to help," Sarah began. "Actually," Dr. Thornfield interrupted, "there is something. We may have some unusual visitors this afternoon. VIPs conducting what they're calling a comprehensive assessment of our operations. If anyone asks you questions about patient care, hospital procedures, anything like that, just answer honestly but don't volunteer additional information. Can you pass that along to the other nurses?" The instruction was odd enough that Sarah felt compelled to ask, "What kind of assessment?" Dr. Thornfield hesitated. "The kind that determines the future of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Thornfield was walking away, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the sharp precision of someone carrying too much weight. By 4 p.m., the unusual nature of the day had become impossible to ignore. Sarah counted at least 6 people in expensive suits moving through different areas of the hospital, each accompanied by hospital administrators or department heads. They carried tablets and clipboards, took photographs, and asked questions that seemed to focus more on efficiency and cost-effectiveness than on patient care. Sarah was helping Mrs. Patterson with her afternoon medications when she noticed one of the suited visitors examining the cardiac wing from the observation area near the nursing station. The man was middle-aged, impeccably dressed, and he surveyed the patient rooms with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property rather than evaluating healthcare. "Vultures," Mrs. Patterson murmured, following Sarah's gaze. At 81, the retired teacher had developed the kind of direct honesty that came with age and experience. "I've seen that look before. They're measuring us like we're inventory." "I'm sure it's just routine business," Sarah replied, though she didn't believe her own words. "Honey, Mrs. Patterson said, reaching out to pat Sarah's hand. "I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's being sold. Question is whether anyone bothered to ask what we think about it." The comment resonated with Sarah more than she wanted to admit. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital had been her professional home for 4 years. She'd learned her craft in these corridors, formed friendships with colleagues who'd become like family, developed relationships with patients who'd changed her understanding of what it meant to heal. The idea that all of it could be evaluated, appraised, and potentially dismantled by people who'd never spent a single night shift, comforting a scared patient or holding the hand of someone facing their final illness, was deeply disturbing. Sarah was still thinking about Mrs. Patterson's observation when she made her final check on Hank Morrison before the evening shift arrived. The elderly Marine was sitting up in bed, alert and focused on the window in a way that reminded Sarah of a sentry on duty. "Still watching the parking lot, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, checking his evening medications. "Call it professional curiosity," Hank replied. "That van I mentioned this morning? It's moved positions 3 times today. Always staying within sight of the main entrance, but never staying in one place long enough to attract attention." Sarah looked out the window. She could see a dark blue van parked near the edge of the visitor lot, partially hidden behind a row of larger vehicles. It was the kind of detail she would never have noticed. But Hank Morrison's trained eyes had been tracking it for hours. "Maybe it's maintenance workers?" she suggested. "Or medical equipment delivery." "Maybe," Hank said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully. I've got a feeling about today. Something doesn't smell right. If anything unusual happens, anything at all, I want you to get yourself somewhere safe and stay there until it's over. Don't be a hero." The intensity of his words stopped Sarah cold. "Mr. Morrison, you're scaring me. What kind of unusual thing are you expecting?" Hank was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes still fixed on the parking lot. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and intuition that Sarah had learned to respect. "I don't know exactly, but I've learned to trust my gut, and my gut is telling me that today is different. There are too many people who don't belong, too much activity that doesn't make sense, too many things that feel like preparation." He turned to look directly at her. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Sarah said, and this time she meant it completely. As she prepared to end her shift, Sarah found herself looking at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital through different eyes. The familiar corridors seemed somehow more precious, more fragile. The comfortable routine of patient care felt like something that could be disrupted without warning. The relationships she'd built with colleagues and patients felt suddenly vulnerable to forces beyond their control. She was gathering her personal belongings when Nurse Mary Catherine O'Brien approached her with an expression of concern. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something," Mary Catherine said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I was in Dr. Thornfield's office earlier delivering some paperwork, and I couldn't help but overhear part of a phone conversation. Something about operational restructuring and redundancy elimination and maximizing efficiency metrics. What do you think it means?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I think it means we're being sold," Mary Catherine replied bluntly. "And when hospitals get sold to corporate chains, the first thing they do is cut staff and reduce services, especially services like our cardiac wing that focus on long-term care for elderly patients. It's not profitable enough for their taste." The confirmation of her fears hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. "What can we do? Hope that whoever's buying us has some decency left," Mary Catherine said. "But honestly, start updating your resume and looking around for other positions. I've been through this before, at my last hospital. It doesn't end well for people like us." As Sarah walked to her car that evening, she found herself taking a longer route through the hospital, as if she were saying goodbye to a place she might not recognize much longer. The cardiac wing felt especially precious, those rooms where she'd learned that healing was about more than medicine, where patients like Hank Morrison had taught her that courage and dignity were not diminished by age or illness. The dark blue van that Hank had been monitoring was gone from the parking lot, but Sarah found herself scanning the area with uncharacteristic attention to detail. The elderly Marine's wariness had become contagious, and she realized she was seeing her workplace through the eyes of someone who understood that safety was never guaranteed, that the ordinary world could change without warning. Driving home to her small apartment 15 minutes away, Sarah reflected on the strange day. The corporate visitors, the administrative tension, Hank Morrison's unusual behavior, the growing sense that St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital was facing changes that would affect everyone who worked there and everyone who depended on its care. She had no way of knowing that the day's events were merely the setup for something far more dramatic, that the elderly Marine's instincts were preparing her for a crisis that would transform her understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the price of doing what was right. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring her back to the cardiac wing, back to patients who trusted her with their lives and their stories, back to the work that gave her life its deepest meaning. The ordinary world was about to disappear forever, but Sarah Chen fell asleep that night still believing in the comfort of routine, the safety of predictability, and the assumption that tomorrow would be much like today. She was wrong. Sarah arrived at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital the next morning at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual. She'd slept poorly, her dreams filled with indistinct images of corporate boardrooms and empty patient rooms, and she decided that starting her day early might help shake off the lingering unease from yesterday's events. The parking lot was nearly empty except for the overnight shift workers' cars, and the October morning carried the crisp promise of autumn in its cool breeze. The cardiac wing felt different as Sarah began her morning routine. Not physically, the same fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same polished linoleum reflected the early sunlight streaming through tall windows, the same familiar sounds of monitors and medical equipment filled the corridors. But there was an atmosphere of expectancy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Hank Morrison was already awake when Sarah entered his room at 7 a.m. sharp. The elderly Marine was sitting upright in bed, fully alert despite the early hour, and Sarah noticed immediately that his attention was focused on the window overlooking the parking lot. His pale blue eyes held the same wary intensity she'd observed the previous afternoon. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, pushing her medication cart through the door. "How did you sleep?" "Like a Marine expecting contact," Hank replied, which was his way of saying he'd barely slept at all. But his tone wasn't complaining. It was matter-of-fact, almost businesslike. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Something in his voice made Sarah stop what she was doing and give him her complete attention. "What is it, sir?" Hank Morrison turned from the window to look directly at her, and Sarah saw an expression she'd never witnessed before. The elderly Marine's face held the kind of focused intensity that came from years of training and experience, the look of a professional soldier who'd identified a threat and was preparing to respond. "That van I've been watching? It's back. Same van, but it's got company now. 2 other vehicles positioned to cover the main entrance and the emergency exit. Professional positioning, professional timing." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "Someone's planning something, and they're planning it for this morning. Should I call security?" Sarah asked, moving toward the phone beside Hank's bed. "Security won't understand what they're looking at," Hank said, his voice remaining calm but urgent. "These aren't random criminals, Sarah. This is organized, coordinated, military precision." Before Sarah could respond, the hospital's public address system crackled to life. "Doctor," Thornfield's voice, tight with stress, echoed through the corridors. "All staff, please remain calm. We are experiencing a temporary security situation. Please stay in your current locations until further notice." The announcement was followed immediately by the sound of commotion from the main lobby, raised voices, rapid footsteps, what sounded like furniture being moved. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized that Hank Morrison's instincts had been correct. "What kind of security situation?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Hank or herself. The answer came in the form of gunshots, not the sharp crack of pistols, but the deeper, more frightening sound of automatic weapons. The shots seemed to come from multiple directions, and they were followed by screaming and the sound of people running. Sarah felt her training kick in. In nursing school, they'd studied emergency protocols, including active shooter situations, but the theoretical knowledge felt inadequate in the face of actual gunfire, echoing through the hospital corridors. Her first instinct was to follow protocol, lock the door, turn off the lights, get everyone away from windows, and wait for law enforcement. But as she moved toward the door, Hank Morrison's voice stopped her. "Sarah, wait!" The elderly Marine was getting out of bed, moving with surprising strength and determination despite his recent surgery and ongoing heart condition. Help me to the window. I need to see what we're dealing with. Mr. Morrison, you need to stay in bed. We need to follow lockdown procedures. The lockdown procedures assume you're dealing with random violence, Hank interrupted, already standing and reaching for the walker beside his bed. This isn't random. Look. Sarah reluctantly helped him to the window, where Hank studied the parking lot with the intensity of a military commander assessing a battlefield. What Sarah saw looked like chaos, people running from the main entrance, cars speeding away, what appeared to be armed figures moving with purpose between vehicles. But Hank Morrison saw something different. Coordinated assault, he said quietly. 3 teams, professional spacing, designed to control access points and herd people into specific areas. This isn't a robbery or a revenge shooting. This is tactical. The gunfire was getting closer, moving through the hospital's corridors with what Sarah now recognized as systematic precision. The sounds were accompanied by shouting orders being given in voices that carried authority and training. Sarah felt terror building in her chest, but she also felt something else. The realization that Hank Morrison, despite his age and medical condition, was the most qualified person in the building to understand what was happening. What do they want? She asked. I don't know yet, Hank replied, still studying the activity in the parking lot. But they're moving through the building methodically, which suggests they have specific objectives. They're not just shooting randomly, they're controlling territory. The observation was confirmed when Sarah heard Dr. Thornfield's voice over the hospital's communication system again, but this time it was different. Strained, frightened, clearly speaking under duress. All hospital personnel and visitors, please report to the main lobby immediately. This is not a drill. Please move in an orderly fashion to the main lobby. They're collecting people, Hank said grimly. Probably to control them, maybe to use as leverage. Sarah, we need to get out of here now. But even as he spoke, they could hear footsteps and voices in the corridor outside. The sounds were getting closer, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they were trapped. The service elevator? Sarah whispered, remembering the freight elevator that connected all floors of the hospital for equipment transport. It's at the end of the corridor, and it opens near the emergency exit. Hank nodded approvingly. Good thinking. But we need to move now before they reach this section. Sarah helped Hank Morrison toward the door, but as they reached it, they could hear voices directly outside, multiple people speaking in low, urgent tones. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably that of people coordinating an operation. Too late, Hank whispered, guiding Sarah away from the door. They're already here. Through the small window in the door, Sarah could see figures in dark tactical gear moving through the cardiac wing. They were checking rooms systematically, and she realized with terror that they would reach Hank's room within minutes. The bathroom, she whispered, indicating the small private bathroom attached to Hank's room. We can lock ourselves in until help arrives. But Hank Morrison was looking at something else entirely. Through the main window, Sarah could see additional armed figures moving through the parking lot, and she realized that law enforcement hadn't arrived yet. Whatever was happening at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital was still in progress, with no immediate prospect of rescue. It was then that Sarah heard something that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson's voice, frightened and confused, coming from the corridor. Please, I don't understand what's happening. I was just trying to get to the bathroom. The elderly retired teacher was in the hallway, directly in the path of the armed intruders. Sarah could see her through the door window, 81 years old, fragile, wearing her pink robe and slippers, completely vulnerable to whatever was about to happen. Stay here, Sarah whispered to Hank, moving toward the door. Sarah, no, Hank said urgently, reaching for her arm. You can't help her. If you go out there, you'll just become another victim. But Sarah was already unlocking the door. Every instinct she'd developed as a nurse, every principle that had drawn her to healthcare, every moment of training and experience was telling her that she couldn't hide while a patient was in danger. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just any patient. She was the woman who'd shared stories about her grandchildren, who'd saved chocolates from her meals to give to the nursing staff, who'd taught Sarah that healing was as much about human connection as medical intervention. Mrs. Patterson, Sarah called softly, stepping into the corridor. This way. Come this way. The elderly woman turned towards Sarah's voice, her face lighting up with relief and recognition. Sarah, dear, what's happening? There are men with guns. I know, Sarah said, moving toward Mrs. Patterson while keeping one eye on the corridor. Just come with me. We'll keep you safe. But as Sarah reached Mrs. Patterson and began guiding her toward Hank's room, she realized they were no longer alone in the corridor. Three figures in tactical gear had appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving with military precision and carrying automatic weapons. They were approximately 50 feet away but closing the distance rapidly. "Get down!" one of them shouted, raising his weapon. "Everyone on the ground, now!" Sarah felt time slow down in the way that happens during moments of extreme crisis. She could see the armed figures approaching, could see Mrs. Patterson's terrified confusion, could see Hank Morrison in the doorway behind them, his face reflecting the kind of combat alertness that decades of civilian life hadn't entirely erased. And in that stretched moment of crisis, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Instead of dropping to the ground as ordered, instead of surrendering to the armed intruders, Sarah positioned herself between Mrs. Patterson and the approaching gunman. It wasn't a conscious tactical decision, it was pure instinct, the same protective impulse that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. "Please?" she called to the gunman, raising her hands but remaining standing. "She's an elderly patient. She's confused and frightened. Don't hurt her. Get on the ground," the lead gunman repeated, his weapon now pointed directly at Sarah. "Last warning." But Sarah didn't move. She could feel Mrs. Patterson trembling behind her, could hear Hank Morrison's urgent whisper telling her to comply, could feel her own heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in her ears. But she also felt something else, absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "This woman is my patient. I won't let you hurt her." What happened next unfolded with terrible speed and clarity. The lead gunman's finger moved to his weapon's trigger, and Sarah saw the muzzle flash an instant before she felt the impact. The bullet struck her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her stumbling backward toward Mrs. Patterson and Hank's room. But Sarah remained upright, remained conscious, and most importantly, remained between the gunman and Mrs. Patterson. The bullet wound was painful beyond anything she'd ever experienced, but her training kicked in automatically. Assess the damage, control bleeding, maintain function. The wound was high on her shoulder, probably missing major arteries. Painful but not immediately life-threatening. "Sarah!" Hank Morrison's voice cut through her shock, and she felt his strong hands pulling her and Mrs. Patterson toward the safety of his room. But even as he guided them to cover, Sarah could see the elderly Marine's expression changing, could see decades of buried warrior instinct surfacing in his pale blue eyes. The three gunmen were advancing down the corridor, their weapons trained on Hank's doorway. They moved with professional coordination, but Sarah noticed something that Hank Morrison had undoubtedly observed as well. They weren't shooting to kill. Her own wound, painful as it was, had been aimed to disable rather than execute. Whatever their mission was, it didn't include massacring hospital staff and patients. But as the gunman reached the door of Hank's room, something unexpected happened. The elderly Marine stepped out of the room, positioning himself directly in their path, his body language transforming from that of a frail patient to that of a combat veteran who'd found his battlefield. "That's far enough," Hank Morrison said, his voice carrying an authority that stopped the three gunmen in their tracks. "You've got what you came for. Leave the women alone." The lead gunman studied Hank with newfound interest. "You military?" "Marine Corps, 43 years," Hank replied, standing straighter despite his hospital gown and the IV line still attached to his arm. "2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Korea. I know soldiers when I see them, and I know the difference between military discipline and criminal behavior." "Then you know we're following orders," the lead gunman said. "And our orders are to secure this section of the building." "Your orders don't include shooting nurses who are protecting their patients," Hank responded. "That young woman just took a bullet defending an elderly civilian. In my book, that makes her a hero, not a target." Sarah, still conscious despite the pain and shock of her wound, found herself witnessing something extraordinary. Two military professionals, recognizing each other across the divide of whatever crisis was unfolding at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. The gunmen were clearly soldiers or ex-soldiers, and they were facing an elderly Marine whose courage hadn't been diminished by age or illness. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer. Sarah could hear Mrs. Patterson crying softly behind her, could feel blood from her shoulder wound, seeping through her scrubs, could sense the tension between Hank Morrison and the armed intruders. But she could also hear something else. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. "Sir," one of the other gunmen said to his leader, "we need to complete the mission and extract." The lead gunman looked at Hank Morrison for another moment, then nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to carry military recognition and perhaps even respect. "Secure them in the room," he ordered his team. "No more shooting unless they resist." Then, looking directly at Hank, he added, Semper Fi, Marine. Semper Fi, Hank replied quietly. As the three gunmen moved away to complete whatever mission had brought them to St. Catharines, Hank Morrison helped Sarah and Mrs. Patterson back into his room and locked the door. Sarah's shoulder was bleeding steadily, and the pain was making her dizzy. But she was alive, conscious, and able to think clearly. Let me see that wound, Hank said, his voice gentle but professional. The warrior who'd confronted the gunman had been replaced by the caring man Sarah had known for weeks, though she could see that both aspects of his personality were part of the same fundamental character. It's not too bad, Sarah managed to say, though she was beginning to feel the effects of shock and blood loss. High shoulder, probably missed the major vessels. You saved her life, Hank said, glancing toward Mrs. Patterson, who was sitting on his bed, still trembling but unharmed. That was the most courageous thing I've ever seen. Sarah looked at the elderly woman she'd risked her life to protect. Mrs. Patterson reached out with a shaking hand to touch Sarah's uninjured arm, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude and awe. Thank you, dear, Mrs. Patterson whispered. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Sarah replied, and she meant it completely. In the moment when she'd had to choose between her own safety and Mrs. Patterson's well-being, there had been no choice at all. The decision had been made by everything she'd learned about nursing, about courage, about the fundamental responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The sirens outside were getting louder, and through the window, Sarah could see police cars and emergency vehicles filling the hospital's parking lot. Whatever had happened at St. Catharines Memorial Hospital was apparently over, but Sarah realized that her own ordeal was just beginning. She'd been shot in the line of duty, wounded while protecting a patient from armed intruders. By any reasonable standard, she should be treated as a hero, commended for her courage, perhaps even given some kind of recognition for going above and beyond her professional responsibilities. She had no way of knowing that the hospital's corporate overlords would see the situation very differently, that her act of heroism would be reframed as a policy violation, that saving Mrs. Patterson's life would be treated as grounds for disciplinary action rather than commendation. As Hank Morrison helped her control the bleeding from her shoulder wound, as Mrs. Patterson held her hand and whispered prayers of gratitude, as police officers and paramedics began securing the hospital and treating the wounded, Sarah Chen felt the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd faced the ultimate test and passed. She'd acted with courage when courage was required. She'd put someone else's safety ahead of her own. She'd lived up to the highest ideals of her profession and her own moral code. It would be several hours before she discovered that, in the corporate world's calculation of liability and public relations, heroism could be redefined as recklessness, and courage could be transformed into grounds for termination. The bullet had been removed from Sarah's shoulder during a 2-hour surgery that evening, performed by Dr. Michael Torres, St. Catharines' lead trauma surgeon. The wound had been clean high shoulder, no major vessel damage, though it had nicked the subclavian muscle and would require weeks of physical therapy for full recovery. Sarah spent the night in the hospital where she'd worked for 4 years, but now as a patient rather than a caregiver, experiencing the vulnerable side of the medical system she'd served with such dedication. Dr. Elena Rodriguez visited Sarah the morning after the shooting, bringing flowers from the cardiac wing staff and updates on the aftermath of what local media was already calling the St. Catharines incident. The gunmen had been identified as members of a private military contractor hired by a radical patients' rights group to expose what they claimed were substandard care conditions at the hospital. Their plan had been to document evidence of neglect and abuse, using intimidation tactics to gather testimonies from patients and staff. Completely insane, Doctor, Rodriguez said, settling into the chair beside Sarah's bed. They could have killed someone. They did shoot someone, she added, looking pointedly at Sarah's bandaged shoulder. How is everyone else? Sarah asked. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Morrison, the other patients? Everyone's physically fine, thanks to you, Doctor, Rodriguez replied. Mrs. Patterson has been asking about you every hour. She wants to write a letter to the newspaper about what you did. Doctor. Rodriguez paused, and Sarah noticed a change in her expression, a shadow of concern that hadn't been there before. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Dr. Thornfield wants to see you as soon as you're released. She says it's about your employment status. The phrase sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with her pain medication. My employment status? I don't know the details, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully, but there have been meetings. Lawyers, insurance people, corporate representatives from the company that's buying us. They're calling what happened a significant liability event. Sarah felt the comfortable world of recovery and healing begin to shift around her. Liability event? According to the preliminary incident report, you violated multiple hospital protocols during the shooting. You left a secure location. You engaged with armed intruders against direct orders. You put yourself and potentially other people at risk by not following established emergency procedures. Doctor, Rodriguez's voice carried frustration and disbelief. They're saying that if you'd followed protocol, no one would have been shot. The accusation was so unexpected, so contrary to Sarah's understanding of what had happened, that she wondered if she was still experiencing effects from the anesthesia. But, Mrs. Patterson? Would have been fine if you'd stayed in Mr. Morrison's room and waited for law enforcement to handle the situation, Doctor, Rodriguez said, clearly quoting from some official document. That's their position. That's insane, Sarah said, struggling to sit up despite the pain in her shoulder. She was an elderly, confused patient wandering in the corridor with armed men approaching. I couldn't just leave her there. I know, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. Everyone who was there knows, but the people making the decisions weren't there. Over the next 3 days, as Sarah recovered from her surgery and began the physical therapy that would restore function to her shoulder, she began to understand the scope of the institutional response to her actions. The St. Catherine's incident had attracted significant media attention, both for the unprecedented nature of the attack and for what local news outlets were calling the heroic nurse who took a bullet protecting her patient. But inside the hospital, a different narrative was being constructed. Dr. Margaret Thornfield visited Sarah on her 3rd day of recovery, accompanied by Jonathan Pierce, the chief legal counsel for Meridian Healthcare Systems, the corporation that had completed its purchase of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital just hours before the shooting. Pierce was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations through legal maneuvering and corporate policy. Sarah? Dr. Thornfield began, settling into the visitor's chair with visible discomfort. I want you to know that everyone appreciates your dedication to patient care. What happened was clearly traumatic, and we're all grateful that you're recovering well. Thank you, Dr. Thornfield, Sarah replied, though she could sense something ominous in the administrator's tone. However, Jonathan Pierce interjected, opening a folder thick with documents. We need to discuss the circumstances of your injury and the potential ramifications for the hospital. Ramifications? Pierce began reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. On October 15th, during a security incident at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, registered nurse Sarah Chen violated multiple established protocols for staff safety during emergency situations. Specifically, Nurse Chen left a secure location despite lockdown orders, engaged with armed intruders against direct instructions, and placed herself and potentially other individuals at risk by failing to follow established emergency procedures. Sarah felt as if the room was spinning. Mr. Pierce, I was protecting a patient. You were violating clearly defined hospital policy, Pierce interrupted. Policy that exists to protect staff, patients, and the institution from exactly the kind of liability exposure that your actions created. Dr. Thornfield looked deeply uncomfortable, but she didn't interrupt as Pierce continued his presentation. Nurse Chen, your actions, however well-intentioned, have created a significant liability exposure for Meridian Healthcare Systems. The armed individuals who entered the hospital have already filed counterclaims, alleging that hospital staff provoked and escalated the situation. They're claiming that their use of force was defensive, responding to what they perceived as aggressive behavior from hospital personnel. That's completely backwards, Sarah said, her voice rising despite the pain in her shoulder. They were the ones with guns. They shot me while I was trying to protect an elderly patient. That's one interpretation, Pierce replied coldly. But legally, the situation is more complex. Your decision to confront armed individuals rather than following established safety protocols could be seen as contributing to the escalation of violence. Sarah looked at Dr. Thornfield, hoping for some sign of support, some indication that the hospital administration recognized the absurdity of what Pierce was saying. But Dr. Thornfield's face remained carefully neutral, though Sarah could see pain in her eyes. Furthermore, Pierce continued, Meridian Healthcare Systems has a responsibility to its shareholders to minimize operational risks. An employee who demonstrates a pattern of disregarding established safety protocols represents an ongoing liability concern. A pattern? Sarah asked. This was a once-in-a-lifetime crisis situation. Nonetheless, it demonstrates a willingness to prioritize individual judgment over institutional policy, Pierce replied. That's not compatible with Meridian's operational philosophy. Dr. Thornfield finally spoke, her voice strained. Sarah, Meridian is requiring us to place you on administrative leave pending a full investigation of the incident. During this period, you'll continue to receive basic health benefits, but your salary will be suspended. The announcement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Administrative leave? Dr. Thornfield, I've worked here for 4 years. My performance evaluations have always been excellent. I was shot protecting a patient. I know, Dr. Thornfield said quietly. But the decision comes from corporate headquarters. It's out of my hands. Pierce closed his folder and stood to leave. Nurse Chen, I strongly advise you to retain legal counsel. This situation has the potential to become quite complex, both civilly and potentially criminally. Criminally? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Reckless endangerment, failure to follow lawful orders during an emergency, potentially interfering with law enforcement operations, Pierce listed coolly. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case. After Pierce and Dr. Thornfield left, Sarah sat alone in her hospital room trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 10 minutes, she'd gone from being a recovering victim of a violent crime to being a suspended employee facing potential criminal charges. The institutional machinery that she'd served faithfully for 4 years had transformed her act of courage into evidence of professional misconduct. The next several weeks blurred together in a nightmare of legal consultations, medical appointments, and mounting financial pressure. Sarah's shoulder was healing slowly, requiring physical therapy 3 times a week and limiting her ability to perform many basic daily tasks. Her salary had been suspended, leaving her struggling to pay rent on her small apartment and cover the costs of her ongoing medical care. Her lawyer, Janet Martinez, a public defender assigned to handle the potential criminal charges, was sympathetic but realistic about Sarah's situation. The problem, Martinez explained during one of their meetings, is that this isn't really about what you did or didn't do. This is about corporate liability management and political positioning. I don't understand, Sarah said. Meridian Healthcare Systems just spent $40 million acquiring St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. The last thing they want is a high-profile incident that makes them look like they can't maintain security or control their staff. So they need someone to blame, and you're convenient. But I was protecting a patient. I know. And morally, you're absolutely in the right. But legally, the situation is more complicated. Martinez showed Sarah a thick stack of documents. Hospital emergency protocols are very specific about staff behavior during security incidents. The official position is that trained security professionals should handle threats while medical staff focus on patient care in secure locations. But there weren't any trained security professionals. The gunmen had already bypassed hospital security. That's our argument, Martinez agreed. But it's an uphill battle. Meridian has teams of lawyers whose job is to make this your fault rather than a systemic failure of hospital security. The financial pressure was becoming overwhelming. Sarah's savings, never substantial on a nurse's salary, were quickly depleted by legal fees, medical co-payments, and basic living expenses. Her parents, still disappointed by her choice to become a nurse rather than pursuing what they considered a more prestigious career, offered limited financial support but made it clear that they viewed her situation as the predictable result of poor professional judgment. You should have minded your own business, her father said during one particularly painful phone conversation. Nurses take care of patients in hospital rooms, not in hallways with gunmen. If you'd stayed where you belonged, none of this would have happened. The isolation was as difficult as the financial stress. Sarah's colleagues at St. Catherine's were supportive but cautious. Meridian's new management had made it clear that association with Sarah could be seen as disloyalty to the organization. Several nurses had been quietly transferred to other departments, and Dr. Rodriguez confided that the entire cardiac wing was being restructured with an emphasis on operational efficiency rather than long-term patient relationships. They're destroying everything we built, Dr. Rodriguez said during one of her visits to Sarah's apartment. The new protocols prioritize fast patient turnover over comprehensive care. They've eliminated most of the support services that made our work possible. It's like they're turning a hospital into a factory. Mrs. Patterson visited Sarah frequently, despite having to take 3 buses to reach Sarah's apartment. The elderly woman insisted on bringing home-cooked meals and sitting with Sarah during her lowest moments. "I know what you did for me," she would say. "No corporate lawyers can change that. You saved my life and I'll never forget it." But Mrs. Patterson's loyalty couldn't resolve the legal and financial crisis that was destroying Sarah's life. The investigation into the St. Catherine's incident had expanded to include not just Sarah's actions, but her entire employment history, her personal background, and her relationships with other hospital staff. Private investigators hired by Meridian's legal team were interviewing Sarah's neighbors, her former professors, even her ex-boyfriend from 2 years earlier. They're building a character assassination case, Martinez explained. They want to portray you as someone with a pattern of poor judgment and impulsive behavior. They're trying to find anything in your background that supports that narrative. The most devastating blow came 6 weeks after the shooting, when Sarah received formal notification that Meridian Healthcare Systems was terminating her employment for cause, alleging multiple policy violations and insubordination. The termination letter, signed by executives she'd never met, characterized her actions during the shooting as reckless disregard for established safety procedures and willful endangerment of patients and staff. Losing her job meant losing her health insurance, which meant losing access to the physical therapy that was slowly restoring function to her injured shoulder. It meant losing any realistic chance of finding comparable employment, since hospitals routinely conducted background checks that would reveal the circumstances of her departure from St. Catherine's. Most painfully, it meant losing her identity as a nurse, the professional calling that had given her life its deepest meaning. Sarah's apartment, once a comfortable refuge after long shifts at the hospital, became a prison of unpaid bills and legal documents. Her phone rang constantly with calls from collection agencies, reporters seeking interviews, and political activists who wanted to use her story for their own purposes. She stopped answering the phone and stopped checking her email, retreating into an isolation that felt like the safest response to a world that had become incomprehensibly hostile. The criminal charges were eventually dropped. The district attorney's office concluded that there wasn't sufficient evidence to prosecute someone for trying to protect an elderly patient from armed intruders. But the damage to Sarah's reputation and career prospects remained. Hospital administrators viewed her as a liability risk. Insurance companies flagged her as a potential claim exposure, and nursing agencies treated her application materials as toxic. The problem, one agency recruiter explained with embarrassing frankness, is that hiring you sends the wrong message to other staff. It suggests that we support employees who disregard established protocols, even in emergency situations. That's not a risk most healthcare organizations are willing to take. 3 months after the shooting, Sarah was facing eviction from her apartment. Her savings were gone, her unemployment benefits had been denied. Meridian successfully argued that her termination for cause disqualified her, and her job search had yielded nothing but polite rejections. She was surviving on food stamps, charity meals, and the occasional financial help from Mrs. Patterson, who, despite her limited retirement income, insisted on sharing what little she had. The physical therapy for her shoulder had been replaced by exercises she found in library books and online videos. The injury was healing, but not properly, leaving her with reduced range of motion and chronic pain that served as a constant reminder of the night she'd chosen courage over safety. Sarah's transformation from respected healthcare professional to unemployed pariah felt like a deliberate, systematic destruction, orchestrated by forces far more powerful than anything she could combat. The corporate legal machinery that had reframed her heroism as misconduct was the same system that was now ensuring she would never work as a nurse again. The isolation was complete. Her former colleagues were afraid to associate with her. Her family viewed her situation as self-inflicted. The media had moved on to other stories, leaving behind only the legal and financial wreckage of her decision to protect Mrs. Patterson. On the 3-month anniversary of the shooting, Sarah sat in her nearly empty apartment. Most of her furniture had been sold to pay rent and legal fees, and tried to calculate how much longer she could survive before homelessness became inevitable. Her shoulder ached constantly, her bank account was overdrawn, and her future seemed to consist entirely of obstacles and closed doors. She had no way of knowing that her story had reached people far beyond the corporate boardrooms and legal offices that had worked so systematically to destroy her life. She had no way of knowing that her act of courage had resonated with men and women who understood honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She had no way of knowing that help was coming, or that it would arrive in a form that would restore her faith in justice, honor, and the possibility that doing the right thing could still matter in a world that seemed designed to punish courage and reward cowardice. Sarah Chen fell asleep that night, believing that she was completely alone, that her sacrifice had been meaningless, and that the institutional forces arrayed against her were too powerful to be challenged by anything as fragile as truth or as abstract as honor. She was wrong, but she wouldn't discover that until morning. Sarah woke on Thursday morning to the sound of engines, not the usual traffic noise from the street outside her apartment, but something deeper, more coordinated, like the rumble of heavy vehicles moving in formation. She'd been having trouble sleeping since the shooting, partly due to chronic pain in her shoulder and partly due to the anxiety that came with facing potential homelessness in less than a week. Her landlord had been patient, but 3 months of missed rent payments had exhausted even his considerable sympathy. The sound of engines grew louder, and Sarah realized it wasn't traffic at all. It was vehicles, multiple vehicles, stopping outside her apartment building. Through her bedroom window, she could see unfamiliar cars and trucks lining the street, more vehicles than her quiet residential neighborhood had ever seen at one time. Sarah put on her robe and walked to the front window of her apartment, and what she saw there stopped her breath entirely. Her driveway, her small front yard, and the entire street in front of her building were filled with United States Marines in full dress blue uniforms. Not a few Marines, dozens of them, standing in perfect formation, their bearing so precise and professional that they looked like something from a military ceremony rather than a residential street in her modest neighborhood. At the front of the formation stood a Marine officer whose uniform displayed the insignia of a colonel, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of combat service and command responsibility. Beside him stood another figure that Sarah recognized with shock. Hank Morrison, the elderly Marine veteran from St. Catherine's cardiac wing, but transformed. Instead of the hospital gown and patient demeanor she remembered, he was wearing a dress blue uniform that fit him perfectly despite his recent medical challenges. The ribbons on his chest were extensive Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with clusters, campaign medals from Korea and Vietnam. Sarah stood at her window, unable to process what she was seeing. The formation of Marines stretched down the entire block, their disciplined silence creating an atmosphere of profound reverence and purpose. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, standing on their porches and lawns, many with their hands over their hearts as they recognized the solemnity of whatever was taking place. The Marine colonel stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air. "Nurse Sarah Chen, by direction of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and on behalf of Marines throughout the world, we request the honor of your presence." Sarah's hands were shaking as she opened her front door and stepped onto her small porch. The morning air was cold, but the sea of dress blue uniforms seemed to radiate warmth and strength. Every Marine in the formation was looking directly at her, and their expressions held a mixture of respect, gratitude, and professional recognition that Sarah had never experienced before. Hank Morrison stepped forward from his position beside the colonel. Despite his recent hospitalization, he moved with military bearing that transformed him from the elderly patient Sarah had known into the career Marine he had always been. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying across the silent formation, "I told you once that if something happened, you should get yourself to safety first. But when the moment came, you made a different choice. You stood between an armed enemy and a helpless civilian. You took fire to protect someone who couldn't protect herself." He paused, and Sarah could see emotion in his pale blue eyes. "That makes you a Marine in every way that matters." The colonel stepped forward again, removing a document from his uniform jacket. "Nurse Chen, 3 months ago you demonstrated courage under fire that exemplifies the highest traditions of military service and American values. Your actions in protecting Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from armed assault, despite direct personal danger, represent the kind of selfless heroism that Marines are trained to recognize and honor." Sarah felt tears beginning to flow as she realized what was happening. These Marines hadn't come to her neighborhood randomly. They had come specifically for her, to acknowledge what she had done, to bear witness to the courage that civilian institutions had chosen to punish rather than celebrate. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "it has come to our attention that civilian authorities and corporate interests have chosen to persecute rather than honor your actions. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of heroism and a betrayal of the values that make our society worth defending." From somewhere in the formation, Sarah heard a voice call out, "Oorah," in the traditional Marine expression of approval and solidarity. The call was immediately taken up by every Marine present, creating a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of her neighborhood. Hank Morrison approached Sarah's porch, moving with the dignity of a man representing something larger than himself. "Sarah, the Marine Corps takes care of its own, and as of this morning, you are one of our own." The colonel unfolded the document he'd been holding. "By order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and in recognition of extraordinary heroism in the face of armed enemy action, Nurse Sarah Chen is hereby granted the status of Honorary Marine, with all the respect, support, and protection that such status entails." Sarah felt her legs growing weak as the full implication of what was happening began to register. These Marines, dozens of them, led by senior officers, in full dress uniform, had come to her modest apartment to tell her that her sacrifice had been recognized, valued, and honored by people who understood the true meaning of courage. But the colonel wasn't finished. Additionally, it has come to our attention that you are facing financial hardship as a direct result of corporate retaliation for your heroic actions. The Marine Corps takes care of its own, and we do not abandon those who have demonstrated Marine values under fire. The colonel handed Sarah an envelope. Inside, you'll find a check from the Marine Corps Emergency Relief Fund, sufficient to cover your rent, medical expenses, and living costs for the next 12 months. Additionally, you'll find contact information for hospitals and healthcare organizations throughout the country that specifically recruit medical professionals who have demonstrated exceptional courage and dedication to patient care. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands. The check was for an amount that would not only solve her immediate financial crisis, but provide her with the stability she needed to rebuild her life and career. But more than the money, it was what the check represented. Recognition that her sacrifice had meaning, that there were still institutions in the world that honored courage rather than punishing it. "There's more," Hank Morrison said, stepping closer to Sarah's porch. "Mrs. Patterson sends her love and her gratitude. She's been trying to reach you, but your phone has been disconnected. She wants you to know that she's been telling everyone who will listen about what you did for her. She calls you her guardian angel." The mention of Mrs. Patterson broke Sarah's composure entirely. She began crying not from sadness or despair, but from relief and gratitude that felt too large for her body to contain. For 3 months, she'd believed that her sacrifice had been meaningless, that the people she'd tried to help had forgotten about her, that she was completely alone in facing the institutional forces that had tried to destroy her life. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "we want you to know that your story has reached Marines serving around the world. From Afghanistan to Japan, from recruiting stations to combat outposts, Marines know about the nurse who took a bullet protecting an elderly civilian. You've become an example of the kind of courage we hope to instill in every Marine." From the formation behind the colonel, another voice called out, "Semper Fi!" And again the call was taken up by every Marine present, creating a chorus of solidarity that seemed to echo off the buildings and into the sky. The colonel's voice grew more serious. "Nurse Chen, we understand that civilian authorities and corporate interests have attempted to portray your actions as misconduct. We want you to understand that such characterizations are not only wrong but insulting to everyone who has ever put their life on the line to protect others. What you did was heroic, period. Anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant of what heroism looks like or has an agenda that has nothing to do with truth." Sarah wiped her eyes and found her voice for the first time since stepping onto her porch. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Hank Morrison replied. "You already said everything that needed saying when you stepped between Mrs. Patterson and those gunmen. Actions speak louder than words, and your actions spoke with perfect clarity." The colonel approached Sarah's porch and extended his hand. "Nurse Chen, it would be our honor if you would shake hands with each of these Marines. They've come here on their own time, many traveling significant distances, because they wanted to personally thank you for demonstrating what it means to put others before yourself." What followed was perhaps the most moving experience of Sarah's life. One by one, every Marine in the formation approached her porch to shake her hand and offer personal words of gratitude and respect. Some were young Marines just beginning their careers. Others were senior NCOs and officers with decades of service. Several were combat veterans who spoke quietly about the bond they felt with someone who had faced enemy fire and chosen to stand rather than retreat. "Ma'am," said one young lance corporal, barely older than 20, "my unit heard about what you did, and we just wanted you to know that you're exactly the kind of person we're fighting to protect. Knowing there are people like you back home makes everything we do worthwhile." A gunnery sergeant with multiple combat ribbons told her, "I've seen a lot of courage in my career, but what you did was special. Taking fire to protect someone else, someone you barely knew, that's what heroism looks like." An older master sergeant, his uniform displaying ribbons from multiple deployments, simply said, "Semper Fidelis, Marine, always faithful. You've earned that title." The process took nearly an hour, but Sarah never felt rushed or overwhelmed. Each handshake, each word of thanks, each expression of respect and solidarity felt like a healing touch on wounds that had been inflicted by months of institutional betrayal and personal isolation. As the individual recognition concluded, the colonel made one final announcement. "Nurse Chen, the Marines assembled here today represent just a small fraction of the Marines who know your story and honor your sacrifice. From Quantico to Okinawa, from recruiting stations to embassy guard posts, Marines have heard about the nurse who embodied Marine values under fire. You have become part of Marine Corps legend, and that is a legacy that will outlast any corporate persecution or political manipulation." The formation began to disperse with military precision, Marines returning to their vehicles with the same disciplined professionalism they had displayed throughout the ceremony. But as they prepared to leave, something unprecedented happened. Spontaneous applause broke out from the neighbors who had witnessed the entire event. Sarah's neighbors, many of whom she had barely spoken with during her years in the apartment, were applauding not just the Marines but her. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door called out, "We're proud of you, Sarah." Mr. Johnson from across the street shouted, "You're a hero." Children who had watched the ceremony with wide eyes were waving at the Marines and at Sarah. Hank Morrison was the last to approach Sarah's porch. The elderly Marine moved slowly, his recent medical challenges evident in his careful steps, but his bearing remained proud and dignified. "Sarah," he said, taking her hands in his weathered ones, "I want you to remember something. There will always be people who try to tear down what is good and noble in this world. There will always be institutions that prioritize profit over principle, bureaucrats who value compliance over courage, politicians who mistake popularity for truth. But there will also always be people who recognize heroism when they see it, who honor sacrifice, who understand that some things are worth fighting for." He paused, his pale blue eyes looking directly into hers. "You are one of those people worth fighting for. What you did that day in the hospital corridor wasn't just about protecting Mrs. Patterson. It was about standing up for the principle that some things matter more than personal safety, that protecting the innocent is worth any personal cost, that courage still has meaning in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush it." As Hank Morrison walked back to his vehicle, Sarah realized that her ordeal wasn't completely over. She still faced the challenge of rebuilding her career, finding a new job, creating a new life from the wreckage of what had been destroyed by corporate retaliation. But she no longer faced that challenge alone. The envelope from the Marine Corps Emergency Relief Fund contained not just financial support, but contact information for dozens of healthcare organizations that actively sought employees who had demonstrated exceptional dedication, courage. Hospital administrators from around the country had reached out through Marine Corps channels, offering positions that would allow Sarah to return to the work she loved, with organizations that valued her principles rather than punishing them. More than the job prospects, more than the financial relief, more than the restoration of her professional reputation, the visit from the Marines had restored something that Sarah had thought was lost forever. Her faith that doing the right thing still mattered, that courage was still recognized and honored by people who understood its true value. As the last Marine vehicle disappeared down her street, Sarah stood on her porch holding the envelope that represented not just financial salvation, but vindication of everything she had believed about duty, sacrifice, and the fundamental obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Her phone, reconnected with funds from the Marine Corps Emergency Relief Fund, began ringing almost immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who had somehow gotten word about the Marines' visit, was calling to congratulate Sarah and to share her own news. She had been invited to testify before a congressional committee about healthcare corporate practices, and she intended to tell the world exactly what Sarah Chen had done for her and exactly what kind of institutional betrayal had followed. Dr. Rodriguez called to say that several nurses from St. Catherine's cardiac wing had resigned in protest over Sarah's treatment and were looking to find positions at the same hospital where Sarah would eventually work. "We want to work with someone who understands what nursing really means," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "Someone who demonstrated that patient care comes before corporate policy." Janet Martinez, Sarah's attorney, called with news that Meridian Healthcare Systems was facing a federal investigation into their handling of the St. Catherine's incident, triggered in part by media attention generated by the Marines' public support of Sarah. "They're going to try to settle," Martinez said. "They don't want this story getting any more public attention than it already has." But the most meaningful call came from an unexpected source. Michael Morrison, Hank Morrison's grandson, the young Marine who had just completed basic training at Quantico. His voice was full of pride and gratitude as he told Sarah about the impact her story had had on his recruit training class. "Ma'am," he said, "our drill instructors told us about you during our combat training. They said that if we ever wondered what Marine values looked like in civilian life, we should think about the nurse who took a bullet protecting someone she barely knew. They said that's what Semper Fidelis means, always faithful to the principles that make us who we are." As the sun set on what had begun as Sarah's darkest day in months and had become a day of complete transformation, she sat in her apartment no longer facing eviction, no longer alone, no longer without hope, and reflected on the journey that had brought her from the St. Catherine's cardiac wing to this moment of vindication and renewal. 3 months earlier, she had made a split-second decision to protect Mrs. Patterson from armed intruders. That decision had cost her everything she thought mattered: her job, her financial security, her professional reputation, her belief that doing the right thing would be recognized and rewarded. But it had also revealed something more important than anything she had lost: the existence of people and institutions that still understood honor, still recognized true courage, still believed that protecting the innocent was worth any personal sacrifice. The Marines who had filled her street that morning hadn't come because of political calculation or public relations strategy. They had come because they recognized a kindred spirit, someone who had faced the ultimate test of character and had chosen correctly despite the personal cost. Sarah Chen fell asleep that night knowing that her sacrifice had meaning, that her courage had been witnessed and honored by people whose opinion mattered more than any corporate board or legal strategy. She fell asleep knowing that she was no longer alone, that she had been claimed by a brotherhood that valued honor above profit, courage above compliance, and protecting others above protecting oneself. She fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges: a job search, a career to rebuild, a life to reconstruct from institutional wreckage, but also knowing that she would face those challenges with the support of people who understood what she had done and why it mattered. Most importantly, she fell asleep knowing that when the moment of truth had come, when she had been forced to choose between her own safety and Mrs. Patterson's life, she had chosen correctly, and that choice, regardless of its immediate consequences, had marked her as someone worthy of the respect and support of warriors, someone who had earned the right to be called a Marine in everything but name. The institutional betrayal that had nearly destroyed her life had been answered by institutional honor that would sustain her for the rest of her career. The corporate machinery that had tried to redefine her heroism as misconduct had been overwhelmed by the simple moral clarity of people who recognized courage when they saw it and weren't afraid to honor it publicly. Sarah Chen, honorary Marine, guardian of the innocent, protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, closed her eyes and slept the peaceful sleep of someone who had faced the ultimate test and passed. Someone who had discovered that doing the right thing still mattered in a world where it sometimes seemed like nothing mattered at all. The shield of honor that had protected Mrs. Patterson in that hospital corridor had become the foundation of a new life, a new career, and a new understanding of what it meant to serve others with courage, dedication, and uncompromising moral clarity. And in Marine Corps bases around the world, drill instructors would continue to tell recruits about the nurse who took a bullet protecting an elderly patient, the civilian who embodied Marine values under fire, the woman who proved that heroism was still possible in a world that desperately needed heroes. Semper Fidelis, always faithful, to the principles that matter, to the people who need protection, to the conviction that some things are worth any sacrifice. Always faithful.